Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa. Here on Iowa Catholic Radio, we are so happy to have you with us on the Uncommon Good. I am Bo Bonner, of course, the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing over at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Bud, what do you do over there yonder?
I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the college.
So we want to thank Mercy College for underwriting our show, mchs.edu. We, of course, are catapulting towards the end of a spring semester. But if you've heard us before, you know that at Mercy College of Health Sciences, we keep that ball rolling throughout the whole year. So we'll have a commencement coming up here at the end of April, and then we'll have new folks coming in for the summer. mchs.edu to go check out if your future has within it being a part of that healing ministry that the Sisters of Mercy brought over from Ireland, mchs.edu.
What's your favorite part of commencement, Bo? Did you attend your own?
I did. At Oklahoma State, there was a lot of people. My least favorite part is how hot any light is shining on someone in all black regalia up on a stage. Yeah. That part is quite awful. The sort of joy of seeing people who I know have tried really hard to just sort of let it out and be very just psyched, right? And especially seeing family members being proud of their students. That is a pretty special moment. And although I don't want anyone to have to drive in a car with me afterwards due to the amount of sweat that I've sweated because of those lights, I am glad to be with all of those people in such a joyous moment.
Yeah, so I think I walked for my undergraduate, but not at Duke. At Duke, we did the baccalaureate service.
Right, I just think
which was sort of a bigger deal. But, we missed out on Oprah Winfrey. I think she was the commencement speaker that year.
Darn. Yeah, I mean, the commencements, when you get into big schools, go on forever. I mean, One of the nice things about going to a relatively small school is, it's not like ours are short either, but they have to start splitting things up at bigger schools and they still go on. So I'm okay that I missed Oprah Winfrey, but I'm hoping that people who attend our commencement are going to be happy with all of the pomp and circumstance that go with it, because it's always a wonderful thing to be there with people with their great accomplishment.
Yeah, there's a famous photo, well, not actually famous, but famous in our own minds from your early days at Mercy, where we're at commencement together. And that year I was the chair of academic council, so I got to carry the mace, which is, it's kind of like, well, I was going to say a bishop's crozier. That's not quite right, but it also doubles as a weapon, I guess, historically. So I thought it was really cool, but I saw this year's council chair, and she was like not looking forward to carrying the mace, and I just didn't understand that.
Well, it's really top heavy, isn't it?
It is, and you have to be careful. Like, don't drop it on the person in front of you, because it does have this kind of like Mercy logo at the top, but it almost ends up being a throwing star. I think it's supposed to be a sun motif.
Yes, but yeah, I
potentially dangerous.
I can think that if you're not used to, or if you just don't find it fun to carry things down aisles, I can understand where you'd be a little bit apprehensive. But I think you handled the thing with panache and style, and maybe people are still talking about how well you carried the mace.
Speaking of panache and style, what's our topic for today?
Well, we're going to talk about the new Vatican document, Dignitatis I always mess the
Infinita.
Yeah, and yes, but and you said that with again panache and style. Already, sort of, I don't know if is it making waves, but it certainly is getting talked about. So I wanted to make sure, and I know that you brought it up as well, that I don't think we need to resolve all debates, or it's not even debates, like chatter that's out on Twitter. But I think it's a fantastic document for us to consider, and timely in many ways. And so what do we say that we're about here on The Uncommon Good, talking about Catholic social teaching? So a perfect time to take this up. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Wonderful to have you with us, whether you are listening live over the airwaves on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or you are one of our great podcast listeners. Thank you for listening to the show. As Bud hinted at the top of the hour, we are going to talk about the new Vatican document, which is from the DDF, the Dicastery of the Doctrine of Faith. I think most people who probably are up in Vatican talk used to know it as the CDF, but now it's the DDF. But again, you say it so much better than I do. The new document's name is?
No, it is. It's a tongue twister. Dignitatis Infinita.
Infinita.
But
which,
I don't know. There's something about the way the words come together that make it tough to say.
Yeah, it's a lot of... but the point is, it means infinite dignity.
Infinite dignity. Yeah.
So in English, it's maybe not such the tongue twister. However, I do think people immediately have decided that some of this is a thought twister, maybe, to talk about infinity and dignity. That's a lot of Y's for any sort of title. But we'll get into this today. So, Bud, this is sort of much speculated, but people didn't really know what it was going to be. Yeah. And I know that for some people, if anything starts to get speculated, they create in their mind what it's going to be, and things either don't live up to it or over live up to it. I don't want to get into the church politics of this too much. But for your mind, just a quick, how this, when this dropped for you, I think some people are arguing, is this sort of a coalition of thoughts of things that have been sort of bouncing around the Vatican, or is this ended up being timely precisely with what's going on in the world today and precisely some of the most hot button topics that people are consistently talking about?
Yeah. So first off, what sort of document is this? I think it's an important question. And so it comes, like you said, from, again, hard to say, the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith. Even reaching back further historically, it used to be called Propaganda de Fide, but in our own time, more often known as the CDF. But it was approved by Pope Francis, and that's why, as commentators have been talking about it, they've been saying this is part of Francis's magisterium. The reason I bring that up is Francis at times can be free-willing, like in interviews and things, but he does seem to have a really specific strategy when it comes to what he wants to convey to the church. And what I mean by that is you can look at his encyclicals and documents like this one, and there seems to be like a clear sort of network of ideas that he's trying to address. So, for instance, with Laudato Si, really talking about our care for God's creation, environmental concerns. And so that was sort of like the foundational document when it comes to those topics. There's, of course, been other addresses on marriage and family life. This one, I think, Bo, and the reason why we just zeroed in on it for this week's show is it really is a compendium of Catholic social teaching, not universal in scope, but like you said, sort of key issues today. I think in the United States, sometimes we can have a little bit of tunnel vision and we get kind of caught up in our own concerns and arguments and things. We forget that right now, around the world, there's various conflicts, even in places that for time had experienced relative peace. And then, but the document's not afraid also to address questions that are really more so being dealt with in the West and not afraid to step on toes. So we can get to it later, but something like surrogacy, where in our culture, I would say, I didn't look at polls before the show this morning, but it's broadly accepted. And this document has kind of like a prophetic denunciation of the practice.
Agreed. And funny enough, I think the telltale mark that Pope Francis did not write this, so to speak out of turn a little, Pope Francis' encyclicals, even as you said, when they have sort of a very tight focus, I mean, I'm trying to think of a very polite way to say it, but they ramble. I mean,
loquacious.
Yeah. So I mean, Laudato Si, which in some ways was his most tightly argued encyclical, is long, and then he had other ones that are long that in some ways are a grab bag. To the credit of this, but this is sort of a classic Vatican argument where you have a document that really starts to say, this is the principle we're talking about. This is why it comes up. We're going to make all these distinctions. We're going to quote Thomas Aquinas quoting Boethius. That's pretty cool. And then at the end, we'll get instances of where this is important. So in some ways, I read this and was, maybe it was just being a dorky philosopher. it made my dorky philosophical heart skip a beat a bit, because to me, it was tangible and said, this is how we're going to, so to speak, extract the principle. There are people who might have discussions, as it were, about both of the words used, dignity and infinity. And in fact, I would love to start in talking about those. But what I thought was very welcome for me, and I know that for some people it's precisely grab bags, not, again, some of Pope Francis's encyclicals on purpose, right, I think were more of a shotgun approach so that people could take and use what they needed to depending on what they were most involved with or what they were speaking to. Here, I really do think that there's a principle that is clearly elucidated, and that the idea is it's very necessary for us to really stress this. So whatever you might feel about the history of the word dignity or how the word infinity is used, this document, but as bioethics teachers, I think we can say, is something that will be very, if it's not easy is not even the right word, very helpful when people go, oh, but the Catholic Church, they're monsters. They tell you to do this. They just put their thumbs down on people. They're just trying to be in control of things. And this is a declaration about the dignity of humans, and specifically waving the flag that it is precisely the wrong understandings of dignity that are the most damaging to the true dignity at the heart of what a human being is.
Yeah, but there was some controversy or argument around that use of the phrase infinite dignity. And I think, Bo, I've heard a couple things. One is God alone possesses infinite attributes, and so how do we understand human beings as having that? And then secondly, well, let me start with the positive, because I'm actually someone who, I think if you approach this in a good faith manner, there's a very Catholic way of understanding how the term is being used. Really, the explanation is that God loves us with an infinite love. It's a quote from Pope Francis, and therefore we possess infinite dignity. As you follow the argument down, it seems like what the document is pushing back against is that this idea that some persons don't possess that dignity because of their station in life. And so for myself, as I kind of read the document, for infinite, I sort of insert the word intrinsic. And I don't know if, like, maybe the distinction I'm drawing there clouds what the document's trying to say, but it's really this idea that our dignity cannot be effaced. And there are some wonderful passages about, like, it really de facto, not always stated out loud, but in our culture, there's this kind of, I think it's rooted in liberalism, but there's this kind of idea that your dignity is proportional to kind of the power that you possess. And what I mean by that is, like, some of those who we remove dignity from cannot protect themselves. And so therefore, their dignity is effaced, but, like, it's just kind of like papered over.
Yeah, I think what people get hung up on, and I'll start with being fair to what I see as the opponents of this document and what I think is a misreading historically. And this is absolutely what I think actually keys us off about is the second part where the document talks about the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And I think it's certainly true that if you look into the history of how we got the UN document on human rights and then how it's subsequently been looked at, that there really is what you would call a secularist or humanist view of human dignity, that if you go back into some of the sources, clearly the UN document has a lot of Catholic social teaching behind it. I think you even have history of, like, Jacques Maritain and some very heavy-hitting Catholics not being, like, on the board, but having a lot of influence about how it came about. But of course, if you go back far enough, you get into the sort of modern arguments where you get the Declaration of the Rights of Man, in centuries prior, that really do start to try to seemingly talk about the dignity of the human apart from theology. And I think some people pick up on that. To me, what I think they're missing is infinity. So on one hand, they get into a very particular scholastic argument. So just to cut it off at the pass, it's true that only God is absolutely infinite, meaning but this is like a very deep metaphysical thing. This is why I think they're misdrawing the analogy. So only God of himself can be in absolute infinity because only he exists of his own power, right? So everything else is conditionally existent upon God's existence. So even infinite things, like an infinite number, right? Like numbers can be infinite, But that's only because God created a world where there's things like numbers and they're intelligible. So what Thomas Aquinas, for instance, will say, I think this is the Prima Pars question 7. I think it's answer 2 or 3. But at any rate, it's at the very beginning, and he's talking about the infinity because he's describing God. God alone is absolutely infinite because God alone subsists by his own power. Okay, everything else then, though, if it is infinite, can be relatively infinite. And what's interesting is Thomas Aquinas, if you read there in the replies to objections, so classically, one of the ways that Thomas will talk about the human intellect and the human mind is that it actually is a potential infinity, because to Thomas, how you learn things is your mind adequates it. It becomes formed, it's shaped, as it were, by the forms that it encounters in the world. And so in potential, since your mind could potentially learn nearly anything, Bud, it's a relative infinity, right?
Yeah.
Does that make enough sense to you and hopefully some of the people out there? So, the idea is that there are things that relatively have a sort of capacity for infinity. Yeah. And so I would think that dignity of the human is a sort of similar thing, precisely because the document trips over itself saying, this is because humans were created in the image and likeness of God and that Jesus Christ became a man. So because of those two things alone, there's a dignity that is bequeathed to us due to the infinity of dignity of the maker and redeemer of humanity, not just because we are like the bee's knees and have a dignity, all of our own.
Well, I struggle with this question in terms of how we're to receive documents like this, because to me, when I was reading some of the commentariat in the wake of its release, I was stumbling upon articles that were mostly critical, and maybe that says something about like my Twitter algorithm. But I worry that we're kind of looking a gift horse in the mouth. Like right. The church has this kind of moving, articulate statement on human dignity, and we get kind of bogged down in the details. On the other hand, I don't want to dismiss like maybe there is a precise way of saying this. Is there possible like misunderstandings built into the way it's constructed? But I mean, really shortly after the beginning of the document, I don't have all the paragraphs memorized, but there are these distinctions drawn that I think even get at some of the concerns that were raised. And so, like you said, at one point it grounds it in the understanding of the image of God. It talks about the fullness of human dignity. So it says that God bestowed a special dignity on human beings through the incarnation of our Lord. And then for a person to move into the fullness of that dignity, it talks about like what's bestowed at baptism and then growing in holiness and things like that. It has that fourfold distinction about dignity.
Yeah, I think we can get into that in a second.
Okay, so I'll pause there.
Well, but before we get that, so the last thing I'd say, you said when you read infinite, you think intrinsic, which I think there's a way in which that's very helpful for people. I just want to add one more. Infinite in its sort of basic definition just means limitless. Infinity is not, I know this will get into dorky philosophy stuff. Infinity is a definition that's not definite. I mean, like that's its point, right? It's not a positive, as it were, thing. Not meaning it's like bad. I'm just saying that when you say something's infinite, what you're really saying is without limit. You're not saying this amount of numbers, because the whole point of an infinity is it's not a magnitude of numbers. Yeah. So just as much as you're saying what this is really driving at is dignity is intrinsic to the human, I want to also say that it's unlimited. Like, so dignity isn't limited to a role or a position you have, which is what you were getting at. So another way I would say this is that the dignity that's being discussed means unconditional. So if there's not a limit to the dignity of the human ontologically, which we'll get to in a second, what that means is that it's not conditioned on anything. And I think that's the main drive of this entire work, is that but despite what you or who you have happened to become in life, or where you start out, or the position, or whether you have all your faculties or not, unconditionally, unlimited dignity, because you were created in the image of God and that you were redeemed by Jesus Christ, true God and true man. Do you think that fills out what you were getting at with the word intrinsic? Well,
so what work do you think the qualifier is doing? Like, you can't drain this dignity, or...
Right.
Okay.
So there's not a circumstance that you would dream up that would limit it in its ontological reality.
See, but to play devil's advocate now, this is where, let's just say it out loud, like the more like traditional commentators have some issues with the way that the document applies the concept. So, for instance, later on, it brings up the death penalty, and it says, some have said that because we're not operating with a more careful understanding of what dignity entails, that there's this idea that like because a person could commit a heinous act, and then we say they have infinite dignity, it can't be taken away regardless of circumstances, etc., and therefore capital punishment is inadmissible. And of course, like they're thinking about how in previous eras the church said that in a different way.
Yeah, I think on that one specifically, if you go read it, I think it was more careful than some of the commentators throw out. Even so, for one thing, what is it? John Henry Newman? We've talked about this offline, but that says, or is it somewhere else that what document says obedience to the teachings of the church is like the final end, like what the church comes up with, even if maybe you have trouble or do not agree with the method or the process by which it came to that final decision.
Yeah, Newman talks about that. It was really during the arguments at Vatican I, and some of his correspondence and letters and things, they raised objections to how the decisions at the council were made. You brought that up in a text thread this week. The one thing that I wonder about with that sort of like appealing to Newman in that respect is he seemed to really be talking about like the machinations at the council, but some of the arguments about the death penalty have been made public and published. So, but what you're kind of saying is like what we're bound to accept is the conclusions drawn,
right?
Not necessarily the reasoning that gets us there.
Because yes, I think that you would in a sort of larger field where we could give examples, and maybe people think I'm making special pleading. I think you can look at, for instance, the history of councils where they got to something like homoousion or something like this, that later councils also purified, as it were. Yeah. And so there's actually a way in which someone arguing against Arius probably would have failed Chalcedon's strictures, but the point was where they got to, and then the church could further elucidate it. And so to me, even with, I mean, I'll hold off because it involves other documents. Here it seems to me that the point still stands, that with the quote from John Paul II, that it's in this case now, in the modern world, for the sake of widely declaring the dignity of the human, it should prudentially be the case that we should not do the death penalty. And what I think is important when you start asking things about, like, does the infinite dignity argument make people, so to speak, shorthand for what needs to be a deeper argument? Perhaps. Maybe it's the case that when you talk about infinite dignity, people don't look at all the nuances of the capital punishment argument. But the bigger deal is this, bud. We can have infinite dignity and clearly be punished because God lets us die. Yeah. So I don't think they get out of this one. So even if you want to talk about the infinite ontological dignity of the human, that can't do away with the fact that God, in his prerogatives, allows us to die. We can get into why that actually was a good compared to letting us sin infinitely and all of these things like this. But what I'm saying is I think that there's a false dichotomy that's created. Yeah. It might be the case that someone can have ontological infinite dignity, but because they lose their moral dignity, which we'll have to get to shortly here after the break, that they still might be able to be punished even up to capital punishment, and that's a separate argument. Yeah. So that's the point that I'm getting at, is I think by throwing out, well, if you believe someone has infinite dignity, you're not going to be able to punish them, clearly can't be the case because God rightly punishes us. And one of those punishments is that post-Eden, we're at least allowed to die. Yeah. And so that can't... So, I mean, that's the thing that I think they're messing up is if you're saying death erases the fact that you have an infinite dignity, then the entire cosmos is very interesting. And I guess that might be what they're saying, is that if you have infinite dignity, you shouldn't be able to suffer death. But again, I think this messes up what's a relative infinity, right? Our infinity is precisely because not only can we be held responsible for what we've done, and so we can die because of what we did in the garden, but also that God came to save us and that death doesn't have the final say unless we ignore the grace that is extended to us by God. We'll have to keep this up after this. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, before we got to the last one, I started rambling a bit because we were talking about contentious issues. So I want to throw it immediately to you. We've promised that we were going to talk about the fourfold way in which dignity can be considered: ontological, moral, social, and existential. And I think making those distinctions, like you said, alleviates some of the barbs people want to throw, because I oftentimes think when they're saying, well, what about this issue where clearly humans don't have a lot of, don't seem to have infinite dignity, the document itself addresses. So I'm going to throw that over to you if you want to sort of talk about those 4 ways in which we consider dignity.
Well, I think this is a really important part of the document because I feel bad, Bo. I kind of gave you a curveball there by jumping ahead in the document, skipping ahead to one of the more contentious issues. But it gets at an important point, and you were really moving into this territory at the end of the last segment. So we talked about the concerns raised about this terminology of infinite dignity, and I think you did a great job of showing how it can be understood in a really traditional Catholic sense. But the document itself, early on, makes a fourfold distinction between that ontological dignity that we've already discussed with moral dignity, social dignity, and existential dignity. And for myself, that second one is really important to emphasize. This is sort of philosophy 101, and we should do this in our bioethics class next year. But some folks, when they hear the term dignity and they see how it's maybe discussed and applied in our culture, they think that the payout or the end result is that there needs to be this like bland fairness across the board. So because each person has rights, they need to be presented or treated in the same manner. And with this distinction between like moral dignity and how human beings use their freedom, we were reminded that justice is such a thicker concept than fairness. And so, I mean, this gets into, you brought up the issue of punishment in relation to the death penalty, so let's move away from that question. Cause again, like there's a lot of heat around it these days, but say you have some sort of rehabilitative program for a youth who, makes a mistake during his teenage years or whatever. That is not contrary to his dignity. It's actually honoring his dignity to say, like, we're going to restore you and bring you along the right path. And so this kind of, in your classroom, you inevitably treat your students differently. This is probably more contentious, but like even as parents, like we like to think this fact, like, well, I love them all the same, which is a nice, like sentimental idea. But, it would be, to make it brass tacks, like it would be unjust to my children to approach fathering with my Gianna in the same way that I do with Dominic. Like they're two very different personalities and temperaments. And so they require a different kind of shepherding. I'm kind of blanking on the existential dignity part. The social dignity, I like that section too, because the document starts with the inherent dignity of each human person. And it even has this kind of like, at some points, like you said, it gets into some pretty heavy rowing with regard to like philosophical concepts. So it talks about the essence of the human being, how we subsist and things like that. But the social dignity reminds us that none of us like exists or operates in a vacuum, that our dignity is always connected to our relations with other human beings, and that you can think of the human community as a whole as like this thick web of interrelations. And so we can't separate these conversations and discussions. We can't just talk about like the rights and prerogatives of the individual. The question of justice at the level of the common good, it has this like reciprocal relationship with individual dignity.
Yeah, I think what is interesting here is, so again, like I like philosophically how this proceeds. They make a bold claim about there being a type of justice that's infinite, which I hope people start to think of limitless, meaning it's not based on a condition. They always say before any condition, ontological dignity exists. Ontology is just a very fancy way of saying like in your being in itself, right? So as an existent thing. Then they make a distinction. Well, then what sorts of dignities can be lost? And funny enough, this is where the history of the word dignity, I think, really bears out. And again, who am I stealing this from? This might be stealing it from our friend Eve. So dignity, of course, in the ancient world was not something considered universal in any way, right? This is where we get the idea of a dignitary. In fact, I would even argue that the sort of noun of version of this is something assigned to people of certain roles was actually far more common in the ancient world than what we've ended up with now. So dignity was something that was given to you by an office. Kings had dignities, royalty had dignity, but certainly not poor people. And so that's always like this tension in the word dignity. But my argument is the Christian sort of elevation of the word dignity to everyone, and especially the poor, is one of these great carnivalesque reversals that Christianity really implied on the world. So even though this document itself rightly says, by reason alone, we can actually think through that everybody would have a common dignity because of their being, that it really was the faith, that it was Christianity that pushed this and turned the world on its head and is continuing to press this point because the work of making people aware of this dignity is not done. But you can lose dignity. We talk about it all the time. We say this person has an undignified life, or have some dignity, man, right? Like we have this idea. And so moral dignity, I think, is the easiest one to think about you lose. If you act wickedly, you've lost, quote unquote, moral dignity. And in a real way, what this document is saying is you're not living up to your ontological dignity. You are this great gift. It's not that you've been given a great gift, which is true, but you yourself are a gift. And so when you morally act against that dignity, you've lost it, so to speak, because you have flaunted what it is. But of course, that doesn't mean you've ever lost the true dignity, because that was not your doing, that was God's. The other two, like you said, social dignity is, we say this, that, people, the poor, the downtrodden, people not in power, they have been forced to live an undignified life. And what we mean by that is the social responsibility to make sure that people can, eat, drink, have shelter, and live a human life. When we talk about subhuman standards, we mean their social dignity has been lost. And finally, with existential dignity, and I think that they could have spoken further, but the document really goes, look, it's obviously the case that you can have all of your social needs taken care of, but still not have a dignified life. This seems to me where they're getting into things like mental health, but also that what I immediately think of is you might have all of your needs taken care of, but if what your life has turned into is just, consuming things because that's all the culture has for you, that's not a dignified life. And this is not like moral dignity is I did something and I lost it. What they're saying is society doesn't have dignified things for people to do. And I think of youth, right, who are yearning for things, and maybe that's why they show up to the doorsteps of the church, is because what the world has on offer is an existentially undignified life, but the church has one with true dignity. And I think that's how all of that ties together.
Yeah, so after that sort of philosophical apparatus, the document then moves into discrete issues. And there's a section entitled Some Grave Violations of Human Dignity, and it moves, one by one through various cases. The one thing that I'll say here, Bo, as a caution is, if you're going to read this document, I think it's only fair to make sure you read the first section before you get to those. And here I'm kind of shining a light more on critics who are outside the church, like skeptics and others, where you can kind of word search to the paragraph that you want to find. But I think as with any conversation, unless you fairly address the foundation that's in place, I don't know. I think you're just going to misunderstand some of the ethical conclusions that are drawn. And so again, like if you were to have this kind of debate with someone who doesn't hold the faith, one question you might ask is like, okay, so you're taking issue with what the church says here, given what's been spelled out in that first section. If we reject that or we adopt a different approach, like what sort of foundation are you going to have in place for upholding the kind of rights that are important to you? Because without that sort of conversation taking place, and that's really tough to do. I mean, that takes a lot of work, that takes a lot of patience, but without that conversation taking place, our ethical disagreements just turn into emotivism, and it becomes kind of a contest to see like who can shame the other.
Yeah, and a second part of the first part is the sort of history of how the church, starting with the people of Israel, into the modern world, the story of how this dignity has become more and more something that we've been centered on, which is one place to turn people who go like, oh, I disagree with the church on, in this one of these later paragraphs, is you go, well, do you know the history, right, of how much it is that what the Old Testament and the New Testament were pushing towards, it reminded me a lot of René Girard, to be honest, but is exactly the sort of work that had to happen before you could even be making this argument about dignity that you are. Another thing that the beginning of the document does well that highlights exactly, like you said, any argument you could have about the second half is it addresses that precisely malformed understandings of dignity are often the root cause of undermining the ontological dignity that it pressed so hard. And so if dignity just becomes into, I have a dignified life, this is the existential part, I think, only if I can choose whatever I want, the document rightly points out, but humans can choose against what's best for them. And if we don't have a society free enough to debate and try to convince people not to destroy their own lives, then we've used the very word dignity to destroy the true dignity that we have. And for me, if you were talking about, like, if you're saying, Bo, what would you throw out more that they could add? I would add a paragraph as this is exactly what the devil has done throughout history, time and time again. Taking a concept like your dignity, the fact that you are special because God, infinite God, made you in his image, and then allowed you to live up into his likeness if you follow the way, and then even, not only benefited, glorified humanity by becoming incarnate and then dying for you. That dignity is so immense, which is another way that John Paul II said it. And here's the devil going like, oh yeah, but if you're only dignified if you can choose to do whatever you want, and then whispers, and by that I mean ruin your dignity. And so that's the sort of thread that if you pull, the entire sweater goes away, is it can seem you only have dignity if you can do whatever you want. But what if what you want to do is destroy yourself? Are we going to actually say you're only dignified if you can, for instance, kill yourself, right? Like that's what they're saying with euthanasia, right? Is that the very words dignified death is a sort of horrific inversion of exactly what is not dignified. And so it's like you said, to go cherry pick the second part without hearing out the beginning, like you said, to these other critics on the other side of the issue, is to miss the point entirely.
Yeah, so when it gets into those grave violations of human dignity, the one that it starts with is the drama of human poverty. Mm-hmm. And I like this move, Bo, on the part of the DDF. I can, in our context, when we hear these things said by church authorities, there's this sometimes instinctual response where it's like, well, or even when you and I talk about them in some context, like, is this like Marxist or leftist? Like, why is the church so hung up on this? I hear people say like, shouldn't the church be talking about the salvation of souls, as if like the good of our soul is somehow separable from or can be divorced from these kinds of questions? I think the document, it quotes former popes, both John Paul II and Benedict XVI. But to me, there was, even though it's a short section, there's a lot of meat here, and I think it's nuanced. And so it sort of anticipates certain kind of objections that people might raise. To give you an example, it has a sort of reflection about how poverty can take on a variety of forms. The example that it quotes is an obsession with reducing labor costs with no concern for its grave consequences. So this sort of profit mentality, how can we save money by reducing labor costs and not thinking about how like the actual consequences for people's lives. But then this next sentence, and I think these were quotes from the Holy Father, I thought this was powerful. Among those destructive effects of the empire of money, it must be recognized that there's no poverty worse than that which takes away work and the dignity of work. And so the document, or its reflection here, is not against, what word am I looking for? Like production per se. It recognizes like there's a certain dignity to work and to providing for ourselves and our families. And so a greater poverty sometimes than even like not possessing abundant resources or something is actually the inability to find work that is dignified. And so I don't know, if folks like push against this sort of section of the document, I always think about the Gospels, and really a lot of things that Jesus said that were most uncomfortable to people were precisely about these sorts of questions. And we don't have to do like the biblical defense right now, but I think about, Christ asking the rich young ruler to sell all he has and give it to the poor, with Nicodemus, not Nicodemus, with who's the guy who climbs the tree? Zacchaeus was a wee little man.
Yeah, you had to sing it.
He asked him to restore, what he's taken away. And then, of course, like the parable for me that really always shakes me up is Lazarus and the rich man who wasn't attentive to his concerns in life. Like Lazarus kind of haunts him in the afterworld. And Jesus has this point that like, for those of us who are rich and well off, we already have our reward. But then like our eternal destiny looks a lot different.
See, and what I love about starting with that point, I think you're exactly right. This is where the rhetorical structure of the document really is dead on, like you're saying. This really ties together what I would say, I'm plagiarizing Charlie Camosi here, is the sort of most powerful, reduced, strongest way to say what Pope Francis is getting at, which is we live in a throwaway culture. And so throwaway culture, that's sort of a poppy line. I mean, I think it's really important and it sticks in people's heads. This document philosophically says, yeah, we live in a throwaway culture because we've forgotten the infinite dignity that has been bestowed on us by being created in the image of likeness in God and redeemed by Jesus Christ. And this aspect on poverty, Bud, really gets to it. And like you said, it brings up the fact that work is good if it's dignified work, but that means that you have to treat workers like they're not throwaway parts, or you can't even treat them like they're, useful to the economy. It's exactly the opposite way around. The economy exists for the human being who has an infinite dignity because, once again, unconditionally created by God in his image and likeness and redeemed by Jesus Christ. It is to turn the world on its head because humans are not throwaway parts to a bigger thing called the economy. We should sooner throw away the economy and do something for the human. And I think that is the way in which this document crystallizes things so much. I'm with you that it's this paragraph that really makes that important. And I think all the other ones in many ways are sort of, it's about like the different types of poverties that humans create. We create a poverty of peace when we make war. We create a poverty in the understanding of the beauty of human reproduction when we mess up surrogacy, when we have abortion. We mess up, we create a poverty of the human body and sexuality when we get into gender politics and the section on sex change. All of those things come from this deep poverty that acts like either the human, types of humans, or parts of humans are throwaway items rather than, one more time, of infinite dignity, because a relative infinity, yes, but an infinity because God himself made us in his image and likeness and redeemed us by becoming a human being in Jesus Christ.
Okay, one last challenge before the end of the show, and I think this is appropriate to end on because it gets on the question of final judgment, which I think is just a nice way to wrap up a show about Catholic social teaching. But I clearly have kind of the naysayers in the back of my mind as I discuss all this. So when we got to the question of poverty, another objection that I heard online this week was there's this section early on where it says, for Jesus, the single criterion by which we will be judged is by how we treat the least of these. It's thinking about Matthew 25, right? I always want to say the wrong chapter. But some folks say, is that precise? Like, will our final judgment just be about whether we fed the hungry, clothed the naked, gave water to the thirsty, etc.? Your thoughts, 30 seconds.
Yeah, so this goes to, how do you put this? We'll put it this way. There's certain effects that if they're not caused by the proper cause, that effect will never come about. It's no doubt that there's people who don't, because what they're getting at is like, you should love your God with all your heart and all your strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself. So it seems like the second commandment is subservient to the first. And I think that's true, but what I'd argue is there is no one who has truly been absolutely charitable to the poor that is not in some way living the truth of the first one. I'm not saying that like at any one moment, someone who is currently being charitable to the poor also has all of their ducks in a row with their deference and love of God. But I will say that at any true charity that ends up being the case, that you would pass the Matthew 25 test, won't happen unless there's a real way in which you have passed that. You will love love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. I think it's a false dichotomy that, one more time, the people on both sides do, but in the end is, I don't know if it's disingenuous, but it's certainly at least in error. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We've been talking about the new document, Dignitatis Infinita.
Yeah, good job.
Okay. So, Bud, I know this is wrapping up the show, but just one more thing, because you asked a great question. And you were talking about people who, the general principle is people who say, but is this exactly does this cover everything that the entire scripture would talk about in considering a subject? Is sort of like, is Matthew 25 like the sole criterion for whether you'll get into heaven or not? The only thing I wanted to add is, if it's good enough for Jesus, we need to be careful to go, it was Jesus somehow disserving or like not really talking about the whole thing. That would seem pretty crazy to say. So that would be the last thing that I would add that I didn't feel like I got to say is, I think Jesus himself is also saying, it's basically impossible to do the first part of you shall love your God with all your heart and it not end up being, and you'll love your neighbor as yourself. And so that would be my final answer.
Okay.
If no one knows what I'm talking about, go listen to the podcast and it will go over. But I'm glad that we got to talk about this document, because I really do think this is something that I foresee the next time I get to teach something that has anything in the realm to do with this, having people read it. I do think it was that helpful of a document.
Yeah, I think this one's worth your time for sure. You know, as someone who has studied and written on John Henry Newman, I get the question a lot. If I want to get into Newman's writings, where do I start? And it's the same way with church documents. There's so many of them. And really, since Pope Leo XIII in the late 19th century, popes have seen encyclicals as a key part of their ministry. That's kind of a nice way to say they've written a lot. I think if you're going to read something that, again, you've pointed out this wasn't penned by Pope Francis. He did vet it before it was released. But something from this era of church history, our own lifetimes, I think this is one, like, it's briefer. It's got some better brevity than other documents. Better brevity released under the Francis pontificate. And it also, like we said, kind of a compendium of important ethical topics. Okay.
Prayer time.
If you do want to join us in our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio, please do so. We pray the rosary together at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:55 in the afternoon. You can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere. And
you want to go to iowacatholicradio.com and click events to see what's going on.
Is my event on there?
Which one?
May 10th, I think.
Let me look. No, not yet.
I'm speaking to Man Up. What should I say to the Catholic men of the Diocese of Des Moines? No, it's about Vatican II.
It is about Vatican II?
I'm the second Vatican Council guy. I think it's official. If you're invited 3 times in a diocese to address the topic,
well,
I need a Vatican II tattoo.
Yeah, or T-shirt or hat.
T-shirt might be a safer option in my marriage.
I went and gave a talk, and all I got was this Vatican II shirt. I've not seen that one, but like a few that are coming up in May. May 3rd, First Friday Mass at Iowa Catholic Radio. May 9th is, of course, the Legacy Golf Club shindig. May 15th, Forge presents an evening with Dr. John Bishop. And then if you go into June 22nd, the Iowa Catholic Radio Family Celebration. As always, folks, just want to remind everyone that can listen that this ministry is beyond, of course, it's not just the people that you hear on air, the people behind the boards or behind the desks. It's your guys' ministry as well. You do such a good job with it, but of course we always ask for your prayers. We thank you for your volunteer time, but very much so we need your material support. Please consider giving a donation to Iowa Catholic Radio. You can do that on iowacatholicradio.com or by calling 515-223-1150 or texting that as well. We're still trying to make up some of the money so that we can make sure that this fiscal year that we've supported all of the initiatives that we attended to. But thank you for donating, and please prayerfully consider donating more. Bud, wonderful discussion. Thank you for the idea to make sure that we got a chance to talk about this.
Yeah, it was fun to be able to lob some pitches to you. I don't know if I lobbed them, to hurl some pitches at you.
Right in my face. No, okay. No, this is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for the Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.